Hello, everybody. My name is Leah Keener, and I'm Bay Nature's events coordinator. It's really nice to see you all today, and I really appreciate you all joining us for today's Ask the Naturalist event with Vishal Subramanyan. Um, Before I begin, I'd like to introduce Bay Nature. Bay Nature is a nonprofit nature publication based in Berkeley, California, as many of you know, and we publish quarterly print magazines based on nature and conservation content here in the 9 counties of the Bay Area, as well as weekly online content in addition to a bunch of different events now. So we do a bunch of in-person hikes and outings, as well as online seminars and talks like this one. And I'm really excited for you all to be joining us for today's virtual presentation and Q&A session. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest today. We're going to be joined by Vishal Subramanyan, who is a 22-year-old wildlife photographer and undergraduate at the University of California, Berkeley. Vishal uses camera traps, telephoto lenses, and other photography techniques to capture imagery that raises awareness about conservation and inspires community action. He has an academic background in ecology and integrates science into his storytelling efforts, using his knowledge of the animals and environments to create compelling stories. His work with bobcats in the Bay Area has earned both local coverage and international recognition through a highly commended award at the Wildlife Photographer of the Year contest by the London Natural History Museum, and his work has been featured in a number of publications, including National Geographic as well as Bay Nature several times. So it's great to be joined by Vishal today. Vishal is going to start by giving a brief presentation about the basics of wildlife photography fundamentals, and then after that, we're going to be transitioning to audience Q&A. So part of this Ask the Naturalist format is that it's really based on questions that you all type into the chat. So if you have any questions during Vishal's presentation or after, please don't hesitate to just type them into the chat. And after Vishal's presentation, I will be calling on those of you who have entered questions to unmute and ask your questions out loud, or if you'd prefer, I can also ask your questions for you. But yeah, this is going to be a really interactive and fun session, so please engage, and please, if you're able and comfortable, turn your cameras on. It would be great to see your faces and to see those of you who are tuning in today. Yeah, so please turn your cameras on, please enter your questions into the chat, and I'll turn it over to Vishal to share more, to share his presentation about photography fundamentals. It's great to see you all.
Cool. Well, thank you so much, Leah, and thanks to Bay Nature for having me today. I'm really excited to be here for the Ask the Naturalist program. So a little bit about me. So I'm a UC Berkeley undergraduate student. I'm a wildlife ecologist and a storyteller, and I'm also a professional wildlife photographer. I partner with nonprofits, government agencies, and media organizations to tell stories about wildlife in California and beyond. So these are some of the organizations that I'm really fortunate enough to partner with, including California Academy of Sciences, Peninsula Open Space Trust, Midpeninsula Regional Open Space District, and of course, Bay Nature. And when I was young, I really had this massive interest in wildlife. And I had these dreams of one day, traveling the world to go on photography assignment. But I quickly realized the abundance of wildlife we have right here in the Bay Area. So early on throughout my high school years, I spent a lot of time here in the Bay Area photographing animals like bobcats, river otters, which have made a large comeback in the Bay Area over the last 20 years, long-tailed weasels, badgers, and most recently, I've gotten into camera trapping to photograph Bay Area mountain lions. And what I want to talk with you about for a little bit before we open up the floor to questions is how people can get involved in wildlife photography to document and tell stories about the really amazing wildlife that we have here in the Bay Area and beyond. So I have generally two methods to photograph wildlife. The first one is the more traditional way, with a DSLR or mirrorless camera and a long telephoto zoom lens. And this is what's typically used by wildlife photographers to get photos of animals at a distance, but still get up close photos of animals in the natural environment. So some things to look for when you're looking for a DSLR or mirrorless camera and a telephoto lens is a long focal length, so you can stay a safe distance from wildlife, but still get close-up pictures. A high frames per second rate, so that you can capture capture the animals in the moment as they're moving with a quicker frame rate, a quick autofocus speed, because sometimes that amazing moment happens in a split second, and you want to make sure your camera is focusing fast enough, and a good high ISO performance, because in a lot of cases, you're photographing animals really close to dawn and dusk, it's really dark, there's not a lot of light left, so you need to be able to have a camera that performs well at high ISOs. So some of the upsides of this kind of photography is you can get these really, detailed up-close images of wildlife. Um, as you can see with this bobcat photo, you can get these blurred out backgrounds because you're shooting with a wider depth of field. You have like more flexibility in terms of being able to move around and choose the angle that you want to. And of course, one of the greatest pleasures is being out there and actually seeing that animal yourself, because nothing quite matches that experience of being able to see and photograph an animal with your own two eyes. And the other method of photography that I use very regularly is camera trapping. Now, camera traps involve having a motion sensor, which is connected to a DSLR camera. So pretty much it takes the photo for you. You set up one of these cameras, and then when an animal walks by the motion sensor, it triggers your camera and it takes a picture of an animal in the natural environment. So these are all the components of what's involved in a standard camera trap setup. At the top left, we have your flashes, which is used to light up the scene at night to make sure you get color images at all times of day. You have these wireless transmitters and receivers, which are used to send signals between the cameras and the flashes. You've got your motion sensor, which is what picks up the animal and triggers the camera. And you've got your DSLR camera and your wide angle lens, which is what allows you to capture the images of the animals. And then you've got a camera housing, which is what you keep the camera in the field to protect it from the elements and from overly curious animals. And this is what one of those setups looks like in the field. So at the bottom left, we've got the camera trap box with the camera in it. Over here, we've got a flash, and over here, we've also got a flash. And circled over here is the motion sensor, which sends a signal to the camera. So some things to look for if you're interested in getting into camera trapping is you want a DSLR camera with the high resolution, a quality wide angle lens to get clear and sharp images, flashes with a long standby time so that the flash batteries will last in the field for a long time, quick motion sensor, one that doesn't have too long of a delay so your camera will fire as soon as it picks up an animal, and a good location more than anything, and areas where animals are walking by really often. And these are some more images I've captured with camera traps recently. Now, the upsides of camera trapping is they allow you to capture these really candid images of wildlife because you're not present in the landscape, that you're capturing these images of animals just as they're walking through the landscape doing their thing. You're able to capture generally more natural behavior because these cameras are all often in remote areas far away from people. There's some added depth to the imagery that you're capturing. Because you're using a wide angle lens, you're capturing so much more of the background in detail, which helps you incorporate more of the habitat into the image. And perhaps what was most important for me was capture images of more elusive animals like mountain lions in the slides I showed earlier, because these are animals that are very difficult to find and photograph in person. And one other tip I wanted to share was about finding locations to photograph wildlife. So my best suggestion for finding the right places to photograph wildlife is to look close to home, because the areas where you can find the most wildlife and tell the best stories about are the places right in your own backyard. Because, when you go to those places, you become so familiar with them, you become so familiar with the landscape, you become so familiar with the individual animals, and you become really connected to that area. And it really allows you to tell the best possible stories about those areas. And I recommend using apps, community science apps like iNaturalist or eBird to be able to find locations close to your home that you can start photographing wildlife in. And lastly, I wanted to talk a little bit about ethics around wildlife photography. So make sure that you're never part of like a large group that's crowding wildlife. We want to always make sure that, wildlife never feels surrounded. One of my rules is often to let animals set the distance. So we don't ever want to approach too closely to animals, but sit on the trail or the road or wherever and see how comfortable that animal is in coming, um, and how it's moving through the area. I always recommend against using attractants like bait, scents, or calls because things like bait can habituate animals, and it also creates an unnatural scene. And as wildlife photographers, we want to depict the natural world in the most accurate way we can. And kind of on a similar note, try your best never to alter the animal's natural behavior. And with that, let's start with the questions.
Thank you so much, Vishal. That was a great overview, and thank you for putting together the presentation and sharing with us the two methods that you use for your wildlife photography. Um, uh, to those of you listening in on the chat, please, now is the time to enter your questions if anything piqued your interest, or if you have any questions, follow-up questions, or anything you're curious about, please don't hesitate to enter them into the chat now. I'll be reading from the chat and calling on those of you who have entered your questions to go ahead and ask. So maybe I'll just go ahead and start with Richard. I see, Richard, you have a question. Do you mind unmuting and asking your question? Or I can also ask, let's see, Richard was wondering, how do you keep your equipment from being stolen?
Yeah, so generally when I'm working with camera traps, I'm partnering with folks who generally have private land, and I'll work with organizations and landowners to keep them in areas that are safe from that have pretty limited human activity. So therefore, like the risk of theft is low. So for example, I often work on the UC Natural Reserve System, which is a system of biological field stations that's run by the UC University of California. And these reserves are all closed access to the public and they're in pretty remote areas. So that's a safe place to put cameras. Or, when I'm working with land trusts, they'll pick the properties that they own that have the least human activity, that are the furthest away from roads and things like that. So it's kind of carefully selecting areas which have less human activity.
Gotcha. Thank you. Thank you for the clarification there. And just kind of a more general question too that I thought of was, what do you tend to do more often? Do you spend your time more often using camera trapping or like a DSLR live camera? And yeah, what do you find yourself doing more often now?
Yeah, so for the first several years, I photographed wildlife from about 2015 to 2022. I did exclusively telephoto lens photography. But in 2022, I switched to camera traps more, and that was because I wanted to photograph that more elusive wildlife and tell different kinds of stories. And since then, I would say it's been about an even split or even more camera trapping because I found the camera trapping to be really exciting in a lot of ways for me because it there's this really certain feeling of excitement every time you go to check the cameras. It's like, opening up presents on a Christmas morning, or in my opinion, much more fun than that, because it's like you just never know what you captured, and there's always that excitement around it. And then it's also really helped me hone my skills as a naturalist because when you're camera trapping, you have to be really in tune with how you think those animals are going to move through the landscape because you have to predict exactly where they're going to walk. So it's really helped me learn about things like, for example, how mountain lions like to utilize the landscape, walking through canyons and ridges, or how I could find their sign in the landscape, like looking for tracks or scrapes. So it's really helped me do that as well, which is what I've really enjoyed. And then also, camera trapping is a great way to work with organizations to capture images of wildlife on their land and on their property. So it's really helps me amplify the messages of the conservation work that these organizations are doing. So I would say lately I've been more into camera trapping for those reasons, but I still love going out with a telephoto lens just to have the chance to see and photograph that animal with my own two eyes, just because I love to observe wildlife.
Mm. Awesome. Thank you. We have a question next from Lena. Lena, do you mind unmuting and asking your question?
Sure. And would it be okay if I ask my second question? Because I think it might be more relevant here.
Of
And
course.
thank you so much. This is such a great topic. I'm curious how you partner with the organizations. Like, what does that look like? Are you asking permissions? Are you kind of working for them to get these photographs? Like, what does that look like? Because I know you had a list of a whole bunch of different organizations that you work with, and like, just what is that relationship and what's sort of gained on each side of it, and how does that work?
So it definitely varies depending on which organization I work with, but generally I'm a freelance contractor. So I contract for a lot of these organizations where, I will work with them to develop a plan to photograph the stories that they want to tell about the work that they're doing. So generally I'm working as a contractor. I also often get grants with these organizations and I work like on that basis. So I would say like either contracting or like receiving grants. And my photography generally operates with like two different models. So one, like I'm contracting for an organization and I'm working very specifically with them for to tell the stories that they want, working with them on their goals. And then the other form is I'll apply for funding and receive grants to work on specific stories that I want to tell about, just something I personally find really interesting or fascinating. And then with that content that I create, I'll provide that to the funders and also pitch it to like media outlets and publications to help spread the word about that story.
Awesome, thank you. What's an example of the second option? So when you're pursuing something that you personally find super interesting, what would be an example of that?
So I've been really interested in photographing lately in photographing mountain lions in the Diablo range. I've been like fortunate enough to receive like funding from nonprofits, from UC Berkeley to kind of pursue that. And then, once I get the photos I want to tell the stories I want to tell, then that's when I'd start, going out and pitching those stories. So yeah.
Cool. That's awesome. Um, oh, Lena, also you had another question earlier that was, what are some of your favorite places to photograph animals? And I think that's a great question too. Vishal, do you mind speaking to that?
Um, yeah, so here in the Bay Area, so Point Reyes National Seashore is one of the best places to photograph wildlife. It's what I would consider a biodiversity hotspot. You've got the amazing like marine ecosystem there with amazing amounts of marine wildlife, and then you've got the Thule elk, of course, and then a lot of terrestrial wildlife. I think it's probably the best place to see bobcats on the West Coast. So there's that, and me personally, I grew up in the area surrounding the Diablo Range, so I really love going to various parks in the Diablo Range, like East Bay parks, and in the areas around Livermore. Cause I grew up in the Diablo Range, and that's what I really love going there to photograph wildlife. So I would say those are my main two kind of spots.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. We have a question from Annette. Annette, do you mind unmuting and asking your question?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. Thanks for the presentation. That's great. Vishal, do you have any references on websites perhaps where we can learn more about the ethical part of the photography that you think what you mentioned on making sure that we are not disturbing the animal and all of these things, and in particular maybe containing content on where to go to learn more about our subject so that we can even identify what's not nature for the animal and when we should step back.
Yeah, so there's a lot of great articles published by the Audubon Society on ethical bird photography and what that looks like in terms of, how, like how close can we get? How do we know if a bird is stressed and things like that? Um, so I would definitely recommend checking out that to learn more about wildlife photography ethics. And National Geographic also has an article published on wildlife photography ethics by one of the leading photographers on this issue. Her name is Melissa Grew. So she's published a lot of that in, Audubon and Nat Geo. So I'd recommend checking out those online articles to learn a little more.
Awesome. Thanks for those recommendations. And let's see. Um, I see a question from D. Fisher. D. Fisher, do you mind unmuting and asking your question?
Hi, Vishal. Thank you so much. In a couple of days, I'm going to be going to try to photograph some great gray owls here in Southern Oregon. And I'd like to know if you have any advice in terms of, and obviously the camera settings, but also how to anticipate, how to be prepared, because it's probably going to be low light situation. It'll probably be in I don't know if it'll be in a forest or whether it be some open areas. There'll probably be boundaries between those, just in terms of how would I be best prepared with both my equipment and my strategy?
Yeah, so I've spent a lot of time photographing great gray owls in Southern Oregon, actually, and as well as Yosemite. And my main tips for great gray owls are so oftentimes great grays are found in meadows or at the edge of meadows. And a lot of sightings are in low light, but I have often also seen them hunting like late into the morning and early in the evening where there is a lot of light. But what I would do for great gray owls settings wise is I would shoot on manual mode with auto ISO, but I would bound the auto ISO depending on your camera's capability. So in my case, for my Nikon Z8, I have it at 8,000, which is pretty high. But like if you use denoise softwares, you can still make that work. And what I would do is, if an owl is perched, I would set my shutter speed to about like, it would depend on the situation and how much light is left, but I would have my shutter speed like somewhere in the range of like, 1/125 to 1/640 or something. But then if I could tell that owl was about to fly and I wanted to move to flight shots, I would switch my shutter speed to like a minimum of 1/1250, ideally 1/1600. And so if you're on that manual with auto ISO, you can just change the shutter speed and then the ISO will change accordingly to like match that. And generally for great gray owls, I'm pretty much always shooting wide open on the f-stop, because in rare occasions there's enough light where you can stop down a bit, but usually I'm pretty much shooting wide open on the f-stop. So yeah, if you have those settings, you can just quickly change the shutter speed to get the flight shot as the owl flies, and then change it back once you've got the owl perched. And yeah, like just great gray owls love meadows, so that would be my best advice on how to find them.
Okay, thank you so much.
Awesome. Cool. A reminder to everyone listening, please type your questions in. We have another question from Tina. Tina, do you mind unmuting and asking your question?
Hey, sorry, I just lost connection, so I just came back.
No worries.
I'm just wondering, Vishal, when you set to go out a certain time of day, you don't know what you're going to see. Do you have because wildlife, I love being around birds and they move very quickly. Do you have certain presets in your head for what you set your camera up for so that you're not fiddling around with you have kind of a close place to start from, I guess is what I'm thinking.
Yeah, so I like to, like when I'm going out, whether it's morning or evening, I like to set my shutter speed higher than lower because one, like if you see an animal, like right away, it might be like doing something like in motion in action. So if I had if I was gonna if I saw something, I immediately raise my camera and take a few pictures before I change settings, which might not always be the best thing to do, but sometimes you truly only have a few seconds. So in those cases, I prefer the shutter speed to be higher than lower in case like there's some kind of movement or something happening and you want to make sure to freeze that. So I'll usually start off with like a base shutter speed of like, 1/800 or something. And, like as I mentioned earlier, like having auto ISO and then a wide open f-stop. So, and then, that way, like, if I see the animal and it's in a really dark shaded area, like my first couple pictures might be really high ISO, but then I would move that shutter speed slower so the ISO would go lower, and then I would take more pictures. But in general, like I like to have the default as a fast shutter speed in case there's like some fleeting moment, like, that happens very quickly, and I want to be able to like capture that right away.
Awesome. Thank you for the help with that question. And um, it looks like we have a question from Richard, more about the contracting process. Richard, do you mind unmuting and asking your question? Or I can also ask. I think Richard was wondering, when you're working for a contractor, who usually owns the rights to your photos?
So when I'm working for a contractor, when I'm working as a contractor, so it varies again depending on the agreement, but generally the organization will have rights to use the photos however they want in any capacity. Um, but I would like keep the watermark. I would keep I would keep the copyright. The copyright would still belong to me, but the organization can use the media and the content however they see fit. And like any personal use that I would have for the content produced would like be like I would check in with the organization about, you know, that and what it would look like. So yeah.
Awesome. Thank you for clarifying that. And let's see. I had another general question about you had talked about places that you like to go, but I'm wondering seasonally, what are your considerations seasonally when you're picking a place to go? Like what are some places you might go in winter that you wouldn't go in summer, or places that you would go in summer but maybe not in winter?
I would say winter and spring is when I really like to be along the coast in places like Point Reyes or Santa Cruz. Just because, you know, there just seems to be it seems to be much easier to find stuff during that time of year. I would say winter is better in the Bay Area generally mm, um, for a lot of what I photograph, which is like mammalian carnivores. Because, you know, the grass gets shorter, they're easier to spot. You know, oftentimes it's a lot easier to find carnivores after it's just rained. So but like seasonally, I like to be along the coast in the winter more, and then in the summer I spend that more like inland, which I know it might sound like a little counterintuitive, but that's generally like how I've had the most success finding stuff.
Gotcha. Cool. Thank you for sharing. I was wondering too, a question more generally, like from when you started as a beginner, which was now probably like 8 years ago, what do you remember about being a beginning photographer? What were some of the resources that you looked to, people that you reached out to, things that were helpful to you as a beginning photographer, and what was it like, and what do you remember from that time?
I would say like really reaching out to other photographers helped me a lot. You know, I learned most of what I know through people who had been doing photography longer than I had. So I was fortunate enough to find good mentors early on that taught me a lot of what I know. And then right now there's amazing online resources like YouTube videos and things like that, which help you, you know, really understand the cameras, understand the wildlife and that. So, and it's a constant learning process. Like even now, I'm still learning a lot about the new camera I just got. So, you know, I frequently utilize like, you know, YouTube videos and stuff to learn more about things like that.
Awesome, thank you. I got a question over DM asking, when you go out in person to look for particular animals, how long do you sometimes stay out in the field waiting to catch a picture? What does that look like? And can you kind of walk us through what a photography outing looks like when you have a particular animal in mind that you want to take a photo of?
Yeah, so it definitely depends on like which species I'm working with, but I would say my photography like outings tend to happen in like a morning or an evening session. So if I go out in the morning, I'd pretty much go out right at the crack of dawn, um, and I'd stay out for about 2, 3 hours. And you know, in the evening, I'd head out a few hours before sunset and stay out then. But like, you know, a lot of times, for example, if I go out in the morning, I could find the animal I'm looking for as I'm walking back to my car, in which case I'll spend several more hours out. And you know, sometimes if I'm really interested in finding something, like, you know, I'll go out like the whole day from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. So like I remember one time when I was like 15, I didn't have my driver's license yet. My parents were going to Yosemite for the weekend, and I asked them just for like a day trip. And I asked them if they could drop me off in the morning and then come pick me up on the way back as they were returning from Yosemite. So that day I was out from like, 6:37 a.m. to like about 6 p.m. just looking for bobcats. And I was fortunate enough to find 3 bobcats that day. Or, in like another case, I once found this female bobcat that I'd been looking for a long time, and I found her in the morning, and I really wanted to see her kitten because I hadn't seen her kitten in a long time. So I kind of watched and hung out with her from a distance, and like, before I knew it, like it was already like early afternoon, and I ended up hanging out with her and eventually seeing her kitten at sunset. And if I'm really interested in getting a photograph of an animal, like very recently, this past winter, there was a rare light-colored badger, which had a genetic condition called erythrism that made headlines all over the Bay Area. And I had spotted this animal, but I wasn't able to get pictures, and I really wanted to get pictures. So I pretty much spent like my whole holiday season, like 10 days in a row, out from sunrise to sunset looking for that badger. So it's definitely like a big time commitment, and like going out like for a whole day is something I only do a handful of times a year. But yeah, the general structure is like a couple hours in the morning or a couple hours in the evening.
Awesome. I loved the stories. Thank you for sharing about your experiences. It looks like we have a question from Elizabeth. Elizabeth, do you mind unmuting? You had a question about copyright. And I can also ask, let's see, I think Elizabeth was wondering.
Yeah, sorry. I think he already answered it earlier. So,
okay.
but I was just typing in a question now, and maybe I can ask it.
Yeah, please.
So it's about safety from the wildlife that you're photographing. Not all of them are that, I mean, some of them could cause us bodily harm. Do you worry about that? Do you do anything about it?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's always important to take precautions when out in nature. Like to put things like in perspective, the chance of being attacked by like any kind of large predator here is like very like exceedingly low. So like, for example, like just recently, like within the last year, we had a fatal mountain lion attack in California, but that was the first one in, I think, over 20 years, if I recall correctly. And we have to remember there's millions of us going into mountain lion habitat every single day. That being said, wildlife is unpredictable, and it's always important to take precautions. So, like, whenever I'm traveling in areas, where I've set up camera traps, and I know that mountain lions are coming by like really often, I'll typically tend to go with a friend and, we'll talk, make some noise, just to like, take precaution, even though that like the risk is like very, very, very low. And I do sometimes carry an air horn, which, the loud noise is known to scare animals. But, I've never really had any like close calls, at least like, in this area. Like there's certainly parts of the world where where you'd have to be a lot more like, on guard and a lot more concerned. And I think regardless of where we are in the world, we should be taking some degree of precautions, but like it's important to also put these things in perspective and realize, the chances are extremely, extremely, extremely low.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think just one thing to consider is that sometimes you might not know it, but you might be putting yourself between an animal, say like a mother and her young, unwittingly, and so situations such as those, I
Right,
guess.
absolutely. And those are like the reasons like, you travel with a friend or like, and you make a lot of noise. That way they can hear you from a distance and know to like, um
Got it.
to like move away. Um yeah, so it's always important to take precautions and try to limit those situations, and that can be pretty easily done by, just traveling with someone else, and yeah.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing. And another last call for questions, or a call for questions. People that haven't asked questions or that have more questions, please type them into the chat. I'll be still looking in the chat and drawing from there. Let's see. We have a question from Richard. A couple of questions from Richard. Richard, do you mind unmuting and asking your questions?
Hi. So, do you edit your photos to add a watermark or copyright notice before you send them to contractors?
I typically do. It's again very like situationally dependent. Like if they're using the photos like for some kind of like, promotion thing, they might not. If it's for social media, they might. So it's like whether like a physical watermark is present is sort of like dependent on what they want. So yeah, I would say like it really depends.
So on your Z8, I assume that's the new camera.
Yeah.
Do you still limit the ISA to 8,000 or do you go higher?
I have like the auto ISO bounded at 8,000. That being said, like, if there's like a really cool moment that I really want to capture that requires a higher ISO, I will like push it up as much as it needs to. But like, I kind of have that base of 8,000 just because like, while these cameras do very good at high ISOs, it's still better to like try to keep the ISO like lower when possible. But I do think it should be pushed above that if there's a special moment you want to capture that requires it being, pushed higher than 8,000. So I have that set as a baseline, but I also have a button that I have programmed where I could still change it very easily if I want to.
Okay.
Gotcha. Cool. We have a couple of questions from Ron. Ron, do you mind unmuting and asking your questions?
Yeah, thank you. Love your work, Vishal. Really great
Thank you.
stuff. I was wondering, are you using Lightroom? And if so, do you have plugin extensions that you go through like Nick, Color Effects, which I've used a lot and really like, or do you just use the Lightroom develop module or something else?
So I used to use Color Effect. I haven't been using it as much, but I did really like it. So my general process is I like to run my images through the DxO Pure Raw 3, and it really really cleans up the files really well. So like if I put it through DxO and then put it into Lightroom, the file is like much cleaner than if I just put it directly into Lightroom. So I like to run everything through DxO first. And then I use Lightroom to do like basic edits, like cropping, exposure, saturation, that kind of stuff. And then I move into Photoshop to do like more specific edits, like, sharpening the animal, like darkening particular areas of the image, like if there's a really bright stick or like, kind of like a hot spot on the animal or something. So yeah, so DxO, Lightroom to Photoshop is like my general like, pathway for post-processing an image.
Great. And my second question was, what are you using to run your website? It's a great organization and like display of photos. It comes up really clean and nice there.
Thank you. I use Wix.
Wix. Yeah, cool.
Yeah,
Right.
I've messed around with other sites, but I found Wix to be the easiest to use.
Cool. Great. Thank you.
Awesome. I was also wondering, just a more general question about how you had said your photography has helped you become a better naturalist. Do you mind sharing more about your process, like how you use like naturalist skills to be a better photographer and how they kind of feed off of each other, and maybe some examples of that?
Yeah, so one of the main ways is through track and sign. So tracking wildlife and tracking in general is like is something humans have done from almost the very beginning of the human race. And it's really a powerful way to read the environment and know what happened when you weren't there. And it's really useful for wildlife photography and particularly camera trapping because it gives you because when you're camera trapping, you're out there and you have to figure out like in the exact spot where an animal will walk, within like a buffer of like a few feet. So, and one of the areas where they're going to walk is if there's tracks, or if there's, in the case of mountain lions, they make these scrapes where they dig up like leaf litter and, with their back legs, and there's these little mounds, and they use it to mark their territory. And the thing is, mountain lions, they have these communal scrapes where several lions will come to scrape in the same area. So it's like a surefire way, if you find one of those scrapes, you can set up your camera and you know that a mountain lion is going to come walking by the area again. So that's one way it's proved to be really helpful, by being able to see those tracks and scrapes. And also, like, when I went to photograph that really rare badger, I was doing field work on the point raised mountain beaver, Aplodontia, which I was also using track and sign for because I was filming these animals and we were looking for their burrows. And pretty much they have these burrows that they have dig into the ground, but some haven't been used for a long time, and some are being used like really frequently, like currently. So, we were looking and we saw like these really fresh like there's really fresh soil outside the burrow. And that's how you know that a mountain beaver was using that burrow very recently. So you set up cameras along that. But while I was doing mountain beaver field work, I kind of was scoping around, and I also saw a really fresh badger burrow nearby, with these really fresh badger digs outside of the burrow. And there was like very loose soil. So I know that the badger was recently digging in that area. So that helped me realize that a badger was in that area. So that's like another way it's proved to be really helpful. And then also, like, I learned a lot from other naturalists about how mountain lions like to utilize the landscapes. So for example, I learned that they like to travel through these, deep canyons and ridge tops, and that they also really like to utilize edge habitat. So like the edge of of a forest and a meadow. So, and then utilizing those skills, I'm able to know where to set up the camera. So that's how it's proved to be really helpful.
That's awesome. That's super, super cool. And yeah, it just seems really awesome. We have a couple of questions from Lena. Lena, do you mind asking those look like our last couple of questions, but
And I don't want to hog it if somebody else has a
no,
question
please,
there, but
please continue.
and I love that you photograph locally. It's so awesome. But are there any places in the world that you just, snow leopards or, any places that you just love to go to photograph? It sounds like mammals are your biggest interest.
Yeah, so I would say like I have like a big fascination with like, big cats. So, like I'd really be interested in going to like Siberia sometime to photograph the Siberian tiger. But I would say like, like the main thing I want to do, like if I were to work internationally, is I'd like to highlight biodiversity in like poorly known areas where it's like rapidly disappearing. So like, places like, Colombia or Papua New Guinea, where you have just all sorts of amazing biodiversity that's like disappearing before we can even discover what it is. Like, because extinction is highest in the areas, like, in these tropical areas where these species are disappearing rapidly before we can even figure out what they are. So I'd really like to use photography to highlight these very like imperiled ecosystems and these like really biodiverse ecosystems, because so many of the species that are there are such fascinating species that most people have like no clue about. So while I do have that fascination with like these, large carnivorous mammals, I would also really like to highlight that lesser known biodiversity because, it's important to highlight the species that we don't think about as much, like the less charismatic species, but are also incredibly like, cool and incredibly important to the local ecosystems that they're in.
Awesome. Thank you. Lena, you had another question as well.
Sure. Yeah, I guess I'm just thinking, it sounds, you're such a fabulous still photographer. They're just amazing and so inspiring. I'm wondering also, do you do videos? Have you kind of dabbled with macro photography? Like, are there other, and you just mentioned like trying to capture that biodiversity. So that might be different types of, like if you're looking at lichens or snails. I don't know how in depth that you would go in that area, but are there some other things that you've dabbled in and have really enjoyed or recommend, or that have somehow enhanced your experience when you're out in the field?
Yeah, so I've been getting more into video lately, and I I have also dabbled with macro. So like my video experience is also largely with camera traps. So with a few of the projects that I'm working on, we're filming animals with these really high quality mirrorless camera traps. So we're putting those mirrorless cameras into these camera boxes and using them to capture video of wildlife. So for example, for the mountain beavers I was talking about earlier, we were filming them in 4K and getting the first high quality footage of the subspecies known to exist. And then also for some work I'm doing with the local land trust, we're filming animals like coyotes and mountain lions as they walk through the area. And then I've also been getting into video like to try to take people into the field with me. So part of the work I'm doing with the California Academy of Sciences is trying to bridge that gap, try to bring people closer to nature, like digitally. And one of the main ways to do that is like, take people into the field with me. Like, hey, what's it like to be a wildlife photographer? What do I do on a day that I go out to set up a camera trap? What does tide pooling look like? And how do I photograph the nudibranchs that we find? So like kind of these behind the scenes videos that take people into the field and show what it's like to capture that image of wildlife. And one kind of upcoming video project we're doing is we're going on an expedition to photograph the only mammal in California that's never been photographed before, which is called the Mount Lyell shrew. And it's this really fascinating species that exists in the high eastern Sierra. So we'll be producing a video about that, documenting our efforts, whether they succeed or fail, to photograph this only California mammal that's never been photographed before. So kind of working on video projects that, tell the story in like a more comprehensive way, from start to finish.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. And Lena says, good luck. That sounds like an amazing journey to find the shrew. Yeah, I
Thank you.
think maybe one last general question for me is just like for people who are very, very brand new to photography. Maybe they don't even have a nice camera, they just have like an iPhone or like, a phone camera. What's some advice that you would give to people in that position that maybe you wish you had heard when you were younger, like when you were at the very beginning stages of your photography journey? And yeah, what advice would you have for people who are at the very, very beginning?
I would say like my main advice is to really like pick a story or something you're really passionate about close to home and focus on that. Because when I started wildlife photography, like first off, I had these dreams of like one day traveling the world. And then I had these like, what I would do is like I would kind of go photograph that thing that everybody else is photographing, oh, this rare bird showed up in Golden Gate Park. I'm gonna go with 20 other people to photograph it. But like if I eventually I realized like, how we can have the most impact with photography, no matter what camera we have, is, telling stories about the places that we feel connected to and, sharing those with the communities, in that area. And I think that's like the most powerful impact photography has is it can connect people to the nature in that area specifically. So by finding something close to home that you're really passionate about and focusing on that, it's really a great way to like, tell the story in the most powerful way. So that's what I would recommend. And like, yeah, I would say that would be my main recommendation.
Awesome. Thank you. Let's see. There was one follow-up from Tina that was asking, have you ever used a bridge camera? Have you?
I'm not quite sure what a bridge camera is.
Tina, do you want to unmute?
The bridge is a not interchangeable lenses. And it has it can do macro and zoom up to 600 millimeters. So I didn't know if you had any, obviously that answers my question that you don't have an exposure to that. It's kind of more compact. So when you're traveling, we just went on a big trip, so you don't have to take a bunch of lenses with you, but I'm really new to all of it and getting some great pictures off of it, but just was wondering if you had any opinions about it as compared to interchangeable lenses on an SLR or mirrorless.
Yeah, I mean, I think something like that can definitely be great and convenient. Like carrying around like big lenses all the time and having to switch them out is definitely like not super ideal. And I know there's like one camera similar to that, like a small little, like a camera without an interchangeable lens that a lot of biologists use because it can do macro and underwater. And it's been like a really amazing way for a lot of beginner photographers or naturalists or biologists to like, see, like photograph these things and really see them up close. And, like photograph these things underwater, these animals underwater, and, see them through that. So I think those are like definitely like good ways to like, start off and get into it in like a way that's like easier and more accessible.
Awesome.
Can I just ask another follow-up to that really? Like, so if you, with your, in photographing nature, what do you use the most? The zoom lens, 600 fixed lens? I mean, what's your go-to setup?
Yeah, so it's changed a lot over the years, but right now, I really like to use zoom lenses because a lot of times when I'm photographing like, mammals, like bobcats or something, it's flexible. It's good to have the zoom because you can, choose whether or not you want to incorporate like more habitat into the shot. So like if you got a fixed 600 mm lens, I think that's great if you're trying to photograph like birds or something like that, where, you want to photograph a bird on a perch from a distance and, get the classic wildlife photo of like that bird with the blurred out background. But I found the zoom to be more beneficial for my kind of photography because like, if I see a bobcat walking over a ridge and there's like an ocean in the background, if I had a 600 fixed lens, I couldn't quite capture that whole scene properly. But with the zoom lens, I could. So that's my go-to right now. But for years before, I did use a prime. So I think you can really do well with either, but right now my go-to is zoom.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the insight. And I think we can wrap up around there actually, but if everyone doesn't mind, I think we can all say thank you to Vishal. Maybe if we all unmute, I'll count down from 3 and we can all just say thank you, Vishal. But yeah, I think for those of you interested in more events like this, please consider joining as a Bay Nature member. I'll send a link out later, but I really appreciate you all joining today and you, Vishal, for taking part in this presentation. Thank you all so much for being here. But okay, on 3. 1, 2, 3.
Thank
Thank
you,
you,
Vishal.
You-
Thank you. Thank you for
Leah.
having me.
Carry on.
Okay, awesome. It was great to see you all, and I hope to see you at future events. Take care, everybody, and have a good rest of your day.